Please be seated. We are back in the presence of the jury. All counsel and all defendants are present. Mr. Eckstein, your closing.
January 24th, 2015 was a prep school basketball tournament that was held at the Arch facility in Central Phoenix. Eric Hood told you that he went to a game that night because the Reno International Prep team was playing. Mr. Hood explained that the head of that program is a man named Alonzo Hickerson. His mentor, someone he's known for 20 years. Mr. Hood also told you that one of the coaches for that team is a man named Greg Wright, and that Mr. Wright coached Marcus and Markieff Morris when they played in the Hunting Park Warriors program in Philadelphia years before, and that he coached them directly and that they were very close to him. And because of him, Marcus and Markieff Morris had in fact provided some support to that team. So we know that Marcus and Markieff Morris, Julius Kane, Christopher Melendez, and Eric Hood were all present at this game, January 24th, 2015. We know that after the game, Mr. Hood exited the gym. When he did so, he was confronted by Julius Kane. That while that was happening, Christopher Melendez ran up, hit Mr. Hood in the back of the head, and Mr. Hood ran down the property, across the grass, along this driveway to the end where he fell past the gate and was assaulted. We know that in that assault, his nose was broken, and that at some point obviously it involved two individuals, and that he was held down at some point in that assault. These are the facts. This is what we know. I mentioned to you in opening that you should expect to hear from Mr. Kane and Mr. Melendez to explain what happened. But trials are funny things, and you never quite know how the evidence is going to come in, what's going to be shown. But by the end of the state's case, it was clear to us that all these facts, everything I've just described to you, everything I told you would come in through these individuals, save one thing, had already come in from the state's case. That last thing, as Mr. Fisher pointed out, I did not, there's no evidence of that, and that is the suggestion that there was a bet of some kind between Mr. Kane and Mr. Hood. But what there is, and this is through the testimony of Eric Hood, is strong and compelling evidence of some animosity between these two individuals. When Mr. Bellinger had cross-examined Mr. Hood acknowledged that at some point the relationship between these two men, the shit had hit the fan, is how he described it. And obviously you've heard the testimony. The context in which that happened is that Mr. Hood believes that Mr. Kane had seen a text message of some kind that he had sent to Angel Morris, and that Mr. Hood believes that Mr. Kane had shown this message to Marcus and Markieff. It was taken out of context or misunderstood, and that resulted in the destruction of their relationship. Obviously something that was upsetting, as you heard Mr. Hood describe as something that was personally and professionally upsetting to him. And I think you got a sense of it in his descriptions of Julius Kane. I know he repeated, when asked multiple times whether they have any kind of relationship, instead of no, we don't have a relationship, I have nothing in common with him. And then at one point he called him a peon. It is clear through word and deed that Eric Hood had some very personal beef with Julius Kane. And we know from the witnesses who testified exactly what happened. So Eric Hood, of course, told you where he had been hit. Obviously, he recognizes Julius Kane. He described that one of the individuals he recalled here at the end of the gate, he had heard wheezing. And he later identified Christopher Melendez. We heard from Jacob Miller, who described when he had gotten down to the end of the property, he saw Mr. Hood on the ground at the end of this assault with two individuals above him. And Coach Mustafa Halal described the same thing, except he only saw one individual above him. And Mustafa Halal told you that that person, who he thought was 5'7" or 5'8" and wearing all black and brown boots, matching the description that was given for Christopher Melendez, had walked back up the road, and then that Mr. Melendez, the two coaches and both Morrises, walked all the way back up into their cars and left. And as Detective Santos told you, both of these individuals a couple weeks ago pled guilty to the very charges that are at issue in this case. So there's no doubt that Eric Hood was assaulted. There's no doubt that there was some animosity between Mr. Hood and Mr. Kane. And it's unfortunate that whatever the issue was between these two gentlemen, that it resulted in this. It should never, whatever disagreements there are between people should never result in physical violence. That he had his nose broken, that he had to go to the hospital, that he's endured some pain and suffering is truly a tragedy and something for which some justice needs to be delivered. That justice has and will be delivered to the people who were responsible for it, Julius Kane and Christopher Melendez. We're fortunate that Mr. Hood didn't suffer more severe injuries, that all he sustained was a broken nose, and he was discharged from that hospital that night. And as he described to you in his redirect with Mr. Fisher, his professional work is going very well. As he said, there was a time when he had to court players, and now players are coming to court him. I'm truly happy that things have turned around and he is a successful person now. But this trial, what we've spent the last 2 weeks about, isn't about the assault that happened or Christopher Melendez or Julius Kane. It's about an effort on the part of the state to try to convince you that three people who took no part in this assault not only took a part in it, but are legally, criminally responsible for having done so. As I told you in the opening, the state's case is built like a house of cards on a shaky foundation. And that foundation is the testimony of Sharika Sharad and Eric Hood. By way of reminder and just to sort of set a little context, the evidence has come in to show you what Mr. Hood's profession is. Whether you call it a liaison or a runner, he's somebody who works with agents, that he goes out on their behalf, establishes relationships with young men, basketball prospects. He grooms those relationships from high school age through college age with the hope that at some point some of these guys are going to become professional players in Europe or in the National Basketball Association. And when they sign contracts, he'll take some percentage of that. And as Mr. Hood described, he had that kind of relationship with Marcus and Markieff Morris. By happenstance, he was connected with this AAU club they played in Philadelphia. And when they went on to the University of Kansas, he furthered that relationship. I think he said that 9 times over 3 years he went out to visit them, all the way from Philadelphia to Kansas. And when he went there, he wined them, he dined them, he did the kinds of things that one does in that line of work. And he did it, he said, in part for personal reasons, because he had strong feelings for these boys, but for professional reasons too, that he hoped at some point this relationship would work out for him. And there's no criticism of that. That's the man's job. And at some point, this relationship fell apart, as he describes, over, as he says, a misunderstood, misperceived text message that Mr. Hood told you he blames Julius Kane for. Whatever happened, it's clear that it was communicated by Marcus and Markieff Morris to Eric Hood that the relationship was over and they wanted nothing to do with him anymore. So that's about 5 years before 2015. And that's pretty much what happened. These guys all went on their different ways. And for Marcus Morris, things went very well. He was drafted by the Houston Rockets in the NBA, worked his way into becoming a starter. He's traded to the Phoenix Suns, where he's teamed up with his brother Markieff. And they're both key players on the Suns in January of 2015. This is a time in their lives where everything's worked out and they've got everything to lose. Eric Hood in 2015, as he described, this was a part in his life where he's still out having to court players. Things haven't developed in the way that they would over the next couple years. But he's also told you that he had no contact of any kind with either Marcus or Markieff over the prior 5 years. No communication in texts or phone calls or indirect, or third parties are coming up and saying, oh, Marcus and Markieff are very upset and you need to look out. Absolutely nothing. And in fact, as he said, he knew their older brother and regularly associated with their older brother at that time without any kind of incident. So let's flash forward to January 24th of 2015. As I've said, there's only two pieces of evidence that the state has brought forward that in any way implicate any of the three defendants here. That's the testimony of Ms. Sherrod and Mr. Hood. All of the other witnesses called, Joe Murray, Jacob Miller, Mustafa Halal, Ramiro Ruiz, and Jose Rivera, provide evidence that shows, not only undermines what the state is purporting to show through Mr. Hood and Ms. Sherrod, effectively shows that Marcus and Markieff Morris, to some extent Gerald Bowman, could not have been part of what they are positing happened here. Let's start with Ms. Sherrod. Mr. Fisher, in his initial opening, described Ms. Sherrod's account as though it was one version and one version only. But as you'll recall from her examination, she spoke with police 3 times and she told 3 different versions of what happened. The first interview is with an officer, Berglund. This is one that's not recorded before she meets with Detective Santos. She told that officer that they stepped outside the gym doors, that Eric Hood was hit, and that he fell, and that the twins and 3 others came over, pounced on him and beat him, and that coaches from the game had come over to that group at that point, again right outside the door, and yelled at them for them to stop, and they didn't stop. She's interviewed by Detective Santos, let's say 2 to 3 hours later. This interview is recorded. In this interview, she describes to the detective that her friend gets hit, that he starts to run, that he falls, and I think she's describing it as somewhere in the direction of the parking lot. It appeared to her as though he was running towards his car, that 5 guys come out of nowhere and start hitting him and kicking him. And she says, by the way, that she has no idea Marcus and Markieff Morris are there. She hadn't seen them in the gym. Eric Hood hadn't mentioned anything about them. She has no idea at this point that they are there. But she immediately recognizes, she says, that these 2 men, who she said she had seen once before in an NBA game sometime 3 or 4 days before then, that immediately, while her friend is on the ground being assaulted by 5 people, she immediately recognizes that 2 of those people are Marcus and Markieff Morris. So she says she runs inside to get help. And Mr. Fisher has made something of the fact that at some point in this encounter, she is insistent on using the names of the Morrises, identifying the assailants as the Morrises. The Morris brothers did it. She repeats their name multiple times. But the evidence was consistent on this point, that even though she says she recognized the Morrises as having been assailants somewhere in this area, that when she goes back in to tell the coaches and ask them to come out for help, she doesn't say anything about 2 of the assailants being Morrises. She says, my friend is being beat up and I need help. please come out. And so, she says, some referees, maybe another coach, they all rush outside, she says, to the middle of the parking lot and yell for them to stop. And you may recall this exchange I had with her, where there was some confusion over what she meant by middle of the parking lot. And she said, when she got outside with the coaches, the fight had moved toward the middle of the parking lot. These are her words. I know she said they may have been taken out of context, but these are entirely her words. I asked her, the middle of the parking lot, is that what you meant? No, I didn't mean the middle of the parking lot when I said the middle of the parking lot. That had been taken out of context. What she said was, the fight had moved toward the middle of the parking lot. That's where I had seen them, right where their cars were parked. And then contrary to the testimony that she had given on direct, and contrary to the suggestion that Mr. Fisher made about there being no one else in this area at this time, she was explicit in telling Detective Santos in this interview that everybody was watching the fight in the parking lot and there were families out there at that time. Then she has her third interview with Detective Santos. This is one that is memorialized on Exhibit 223. You all will recall this is a series of maps that the detective had given to Ms. Sherrod so she could demonstrate exactly where things happened out there. And so she says in this interview that Mr. Hood doesn't fall where he gets hit, but he runs towards his car, he falls, and then she sees 5 people attacking him. As soon as he fell, she says, she saw 5 people jump in. She says she sees both of the Morris brothers. And then, of course, she identifies multiple things happening in this area where she's written. She's written where she sees, as she described it, in the grass or dirt, somebody wearing an Army bandana, 2 of the Suns players, and she was explicit, not just recognizing that grass or dirt area, but other landmarks that caused her to remember that this was the precise place where things happened. You recall I asked her if she remembered this small Ramada building. She said she did. That was something that was important to her. These uncovered picnic tables, she absolutely remembered those. Those were something that were important to her. And then she remembered as well that she was able to see clearly what had happened because there was some lighting in this area. She couldn't quite remember where the light was, or at least she couldn't find it when she was looking at that map. And of course we know that the map that she's drawing on, as we heard from Joe Murray and then ultimately Detective Santos, is a version of the facility that didn't exist at the time of this incident. And she couldn't have recognized any of those things because they weren't there. So we know her accounts and her in-court testimony are at odds with all of the other evidence in this case. They're at odds with Mr. Hood's account, and I know Mr. Fisher suggested that at some point, maybe I didn't quite hear this correctly, but the implication was that Ms. Sherrod and Mr. Hood had sat together and talked to each other about what had happened, and therefore that the fact that their stories are somewhat different shows they didn't confabulate to coordinate their stories. My recollection, and you all have your own recollections, is that Ms. Sherrod was explicit and Mr. Hood was explicit that they never talked substantively about what each of them had observed. And we know for sure that her account is at odds with that of coaches Halal and Miller. She doesn't say, and Mr. Fisher tried to emphasize this, that she goes in, gets the coaches, they come out, and there's nothing to be seen in this area. And that is explicitly what Halal and Miller said. When they come out of those gym doors, There is nothing on the patio, nothing near the picnic tables, nothing near the parking lot. What she says is when she comes out with the coaches and maybe a referee, those individuals come out and the three of them see an ongoing altercation in this area, right here where it says picnic tables. That's what she said. She said in 2 of the interviews. That's what she said on the stand. And that the coaches are coming over, they're yelling at the people, they're trying to get them off, and that nobody backs away. Well, Halal and Miller didn't see that. What she said and what they said cannot possibly be reconciled. The same is true with what Joe Murray had said. Mr. Murray told you that just before the last game was over, as facilities manager, he had gone out a different door from the gym building, emptied some garbage at this end of the parking lot, and was walking back. So the game's not quite over. He goes out, empties the garbage. Presumably the game is just ending or had ended. And as he's coming back, he sees individuals running through this area towards the driveway, consistent with what everybody else says. And if Ms. Sherrod sees, as she said she did, people beating up Eric Hood, 5 people beating him up for 5 minutes, 5 minutes in this area, it's not possible that Murray, Halal, Miller, the tens of other players and coaches out there that the police interviewed, all of whom saw nothing, not a thing in that area, could have been mistaken. And we further know why she was lying. We know, number one, she had a romantic interest in Eric Hood. You recall the crush versus relationship philosophical discussion that she and I had. It's apparent from her text messages that she liked him, and she wanted to be more than friends. And there's nothing wrong with that. But what was wrong is that she lied to the detectives about it. She says she did so after the detective told her, it really helps the case if y'all are just friends. And for sure she knew that Detective Santos was going to question her and question her veracity if he believed that she had some desire beyond just being friends. So to help any prospect she had of a relationship, she lied to help Eric Hood. And we know more about her personal financial interest in this. There's the text messages that we saw from her. And no, the text messages don't negate the possibility of things happening before those text messages were sent, but what they do is they tell you about the person who's sending them, their intentions, their motives, their credibility. And what she said about this in a January 29th text to her ex-husband is that she's a witness and she's about to get a check, that we had gotten Chris Brown's lawyer. She's not snitching, and she said that they, referring to the Morrises, had thought they were fly when they came and pulled up in their Phantom, the car they had driven that evening. But Reek, referring to herself, is going to be driving that soon. If they settle, it's 20 mil. If not, we go into court. The next day, she sends a text message to somebody else. They had probably heard it on the news. She's the eyewitness. We are going to sue them, so I might be rich here pretty soon. And then on February 8th, she sent a series of messages to a friend of hers from Maryland that hopefully in a few months she can move once she gets a check, LOL, from the twins, the ones that were suing, we are suing, playing in the NBA, asked if they'd heard her too, emotional distress, LOL. I don't want to spend any more time on Sharika Sherrod, and I feel like I've already given her more than she deserves. I just want to express, I guess, the sort of disbelief I have that the police and the state have relied on her testimony for the entirety of this case and brought her in here and had her sit up on that stand and offer testimony that they knew was entirely at odds with every other piece of evidence in this case, with the hopes that maybe it would confuse you, or it's, it shows some level of guilt. We know it's at odds with everything else, but maybe there'll be 1 or 2 or 3 jurors out there who will find something convincing in this story. It's insulting to you, it's insulting to the process, and I don't want to talk about it anymore. So it's understandable why the police initially believed Eric Hood. He had clearly been injured. There's no doubt about that. And his description of where this assault had taken place was generally consistent with all the other evidence, with Miller and Murray and Halal, Rivera, Ruiz, in terms of things happening, first at the door, running down, falling past the gate. And you can see why he seemed very credible to them at first. But as you start to look below the surface, you see there are many, many problems with his account. And you recognize that thing that we all know, and that's just because a person is telling you the truth about one thing, doesn't mean they're telling you the truth about everything. It's particularly so whereas here there's a really strong motive to lie. Let's talk about Mr. Hood's account of the incident versus the evidence. So he says he was hit, he runs, he's chased, he said, by all 5 defendants. He was certain of that. So among the defendants we know we have, in this case, 2 players in the National Basketball Association and somebody who at the time was in the process of training to potentially enter the National Football League as a defensive back. And Mr. Hood, in his initial interview with the detective, so this is not the first interview with Officer Berglund, but his initial recorded interview with Detective Santos, said the thing that upset him most, these are his words, was not being assaulted, not having the relationship ruptured, but rather that he let these jokers catch him. And he can't believe he let them run him down. This is what he said to the detective was the thing that upset him most. Like many of the things he said, it reveals a lot. It reveals that he knew who had run him down. He knew it was Julius Cain, a peon, somebody he has nothing in common with, somebody's not worth his time, somebody who is below him. And a little guy who he didn't know, but he knew he was small, and he remembered that he had been wheezing when he heard him down by the gate. And for somebody like Eric Hood, who himself was a very good athlete, that was something that he found obviously personally offensive. And he was further, as he testified, he told you that if it had only been 2 people, he would have happily or easily fought that. And so he was embarrassed. He was embarrassed that Julius Cain, again, somebody who's of far lesser value than he is as a human being, and the small person with asthma were the ones who had assaulted him. So Mr. Hood told you that he fell, he went on about not actually slipping, but it was simply his momentum that brought him down, and he tells you that he can see both of the Morrises who are standing near. That Mr. Cain and 1 or 2 of the other men who are there start beating him, and that at some point, Mr. Cain, who is holding Mr. Hood to the ground, calls out to Marcus Morris by Mook, his nickname, and that Marcus comes over and kicks him while Markeef stays away. And as Hood described in his testimony, I can't remember exactly when he said it, but he said that he believed this all took place, the actual physical assault, so the beating, for 12 minutes. Mr. Halal, Mustafa Halal, and I noticed his name was mentioned very rarely in Mr. Fisher's opening or closing because, well, I think we all recall his testimony, which if there was nothing else in this case, if the only things that there were Mr. Hood's testimony, Ms. Sharad's testimony, without any of those things we know that show the inconsistencies and motives and impeachment and all those things, and Mr. Halal's testimony, just those 3 things, that would be reasonable doubt. Because what Mustafa Halal told you is that when he came out the gym door, he looked in the parking lot, he didn't see anything, but he saw the Morris brothers near where the board picnic tables is on this map, that they started to jog down this driveway, and he's watching them the whole time, that he and Jacob Miller, who's running with him, essentially get to the Ramada area where the two of them stop with Markeith, that Marcus Morris gets a little bit closer, but that he is somewhere between 10 and 20 feet from the altercation. You recall that I asked him to place me relative to the bailiff's desk to show how far that distance was, and I think I started here, and he kept moving me, and he kept moving me, and he kept moving me, and ultimately I was right about here, and said that based on this distance, it was clear that to him that Marcus Morris wasn't part of whatever was happening over there. And then whatever was happening over there ended, and the person matching the description of Christopher Melendez walked back, caught up with Marcus, and then the five of them walked back. What Jacob Miller said is that he saw, when he came out of the doors, instead of seeing the Morrises in the grass area, he said he saw one Morris, we believe later was Markeith Morris, and then he saw them in the parking lot. So this parking lot, and I'll come back and talk more about this later, but I think he picked sort of this spot right around here where he saw where he recalls where he believes Markeith Morris was. I'll just point out briefly, like I'll come back to this. In terms of a line of sight from this parking lot down to where the gate area is, you'll notice there are two structures in the way, buildings, apartment buildings that happen to be right in the way, which would have made it impossible for anybody from that spot to have seen what is happening by the gate. And he said that, in addition to that he ran down, he called out Morris, that the person he believes is Markeith Morris started running, he started following him, Halal's running with them, they get a little past the Ramada, and then when he gets down there, he sees the person he believes is Marcus Morris, and he said that person was at least 15 feet from the altercation, and he said he was definitely not part of it. Again, same description, it's over as soon as they get there and they all walk back. Ramiro Ruiz, one of the two individuals who's training in this Ramada area, along with his cousin, Jose Rivera, Ruiz says he wasn't really paying attention. The guy's training for some mixed martial arts. And he recalled one person who's being chased by 3 or 4 people. I asked him about the heights of those people, and he said for sure, none of those people was anywhere close to 6'9" or 6'10". Mr. Rivera, similar description in terms of he's not really paying attention. His numbers were even higher. He thought it was between 6 or 8 people. He didn't recall a thing about them in terms of race or clothing, anything other than height. And he said, for sure, none of those people were close to 6'9". That would have stood out. And then Joe Murray, as you all will recall, said he, as he's coming back from the parking lot, saw 3 to 4 people running down that field area. So let's take a step back and review what all this means. Based on what Mr. Ruiz and Mr. Rivera are saying, it shows that however many people are running after Mr. Hood at that point, Marcus and Markeith Morris were not among those people. Based on what Mr. Miller is saying, Markeith Morris could not have been part of anything that was happening here at the gate. And based on what Mustafa Halal is saying, neither Marcus nor Markeith could have been part of that. So these accounts create much more than reasonable doubt as to whether Marcus and Markeith were involved in any physical assault. Of course, there are many, many more problems with the state's case than that. So let's talk about Eric Hood's shifting account of what transpired. So he explained to the detective, and he testified on the stand, that his original intention after having been assaulted was to go home. He was either going to drive himself home or have Ms. Sherrod take him home. It makes sense. As he described elsewhere in his interview, he was embarrassed about what had happened. And he would have known that, certainly based on one of the people who had assaulted him, who he knew was Julius Cain, a peon, as it were, no assets, no real need to call the police, because there's not going to be any kind of civil claim against that guy. So I'm just going to go home. I'm already embarrassed about this. I'll move on with things. But that's not what happened, because at 7:29, he receives a phone call from his mentor, 20-year friend, Alonzo Hickerson. And Hickerson tells him that Jacob Miller and a number of players had seen both of the Morrises physically assaulting him. So if Mr. Hood had already seen this, why would this phone call have made any difference to him? It wouldn't. I mean, he would have known it. He already would have seen it. His plan would have been established. But this call, this information, causes him to do a 180. Instead of going home, he's calling the police, he's going to the hospital, and he's going to start giving accounts where he implicates both of the Morrises in the physical assault. The second shift in his testimony happens in the third interview he has, the second one with Detective Santos. This is January 26th, 2 days after the assault. Mr. Hood says in there that 2 more times he's certain that Markeith Morris had hit him and kicked him. And you all will recall, I won't review all of these now, but between the first recorded interview and the second recorded interview, there are 9 total times when he unambiguously says that Markeith Morris physically attacked him. I will point out these 2 because they're in this particular interview, this January 26th interview. The detective asks, did you actually see the twins confronting you? Yes, they was kicking me. The detective asks, and that you know with certainty that was the 2 brothers were kicking you while Julius was holding you down. All of those guys were kicking me, no question, no doubts. So there's 5 people assaulting you? Yes. How many people were assaulting you there? 5. For sure? For sure, from what I can remember, yes. Detective asks, okay, because I mean, you know, you're laying down and you're balled up, and you're very sure that you actually saw that many people. I'm sure that I saw everybody in the gym come over and attack me. Detective asks, so do you know who those 5 people are? I only know 3 personally. So give me the names of those 3 people. Marcus Morris, Julius, and Markeith Morris. You'll recall he gets a phone call from his attorney. He's out of the room for 12 minutes. He comes back into the room, and the first words out of his mouth are, Keith was really back by his vehicle. You know, I can't say for sure. I know for a fact Marcus kicked me. I know for a fact. Keith, I know, is in the vicinity. I know for sure that Marcus was actually stomping me. So Santos asks in this interview how Eric Hood could have seen Markeith if he was back by his vehicle, whether his vehicle was close to Coulter. Mr. Hood explains, no, it wasn't. They're using one of these maps, but they didn't actually mark it on the map. Unfortunately, Mr. Hood responds to him that he saw Markeith by his vehicle when he ran past. And then the detective asks him, so did Markeith stay by his vehicle, or did he come all the way down to the street with the other guys? And Mr. Hood says, he came, he didn't come into the mix, he didn't come in there, he was more on the back end. So Santos asks, because it's still a little unclear, and it's, I think, slightly unclear based on the in-court testimony, what staying back meant. And you can see from the course of the interview as described in their testimony that they're looking at this map and talking about what had happened. Mr. Hood says, "I would say Keith was more so back here." The detective says, "Okay, that's quite a ways." And Mr. Hood responds, "Quite a distance." "Right. Quite a distance, right." So you recall Mr. Hood ultimately testified that when he said Markeith Morris was more on the back end, what he meant was 10, 15 feet away by the gate where the assault was taking place. It's totally irreconcilable. That's what it is. That account with what he told the detective. More on the back end, ran by his vehicle. That's quite a ways. That's quite a ways. That's quite a ways. And even though the detective had not asked him anything about Marcus Morris, as soon as he's done saying, "I didn't see Markeith, he's back in the parking lot, I can't say he was part of a physical assault," the next words out of his mouth, "I can say for a fact, with my hand on a 6 stack of Bibles, that Markeith came, not Keith, I'm sorry, Marcus came, and kicked me in my head more than once. I can say that for sure. No, absolutely no doubts. None, I know that for a fact." So Mr. Hood's explanation for this change in testimony was that his memory had improved over time. I think he said at some point his lawyers in this 12-minute phone call had called to check on his health, told him to tell the truth. Well, the detective told you there was no evidence of any kind of impairment of memory. Mr. Hood's account that he gave in his initial unrecorded interview, first interview with the detective, nothing that the police saw that would have caused them to think he could not give his best account. But even if you assume there was some problem in those first 2 accounts, he changes his story in the middle of this account. Remember, those 2 instances I just read to you explicitly where he says that Markeith Morris was physically assaulting him. That's in this interview. Then he's gone for 12 minutes and he comes back and now he can't remember. I don't know how one's memory can improve in a 12-minute phone call with a lawyer like that. I think it's just in no way credible. Obviously the health, his lawyer had spoken with him, and you'll have back in the jury room with you Exhibit 184, which is a call log from Mr. Hood's cell phone. And you will see on there that he had spoken with his lawyer just prior to this interview, and that the lawyer begins calling him as the interview goes on, calls him 5 times in the course of this interview. He must have really wanted to make sure that he was doing okay. And to tell his client to tell the truth, well, that's just self-evident. It's obvious what happened in this interview. The statement that Eric Hood gave in the context of this interview matches perfectly with the testimony of Jacob Miller. Jacob Miller was going to say he looked into the parking lot and saw Markeith Morris, and he could not have been part of it. That's what Mr. Hood's testimony is, that he was back by his car in the parking lot. There was no other way he would have had any idea. He certainly hadn't said anything in the prior interviews about Markeith having been in a parking lot, having run by him, being way, way back there. It matches perfectly with what Jacob Miller said. And we know from what Jacob Miller said that in the 2 days following the incident, he spoke multiple times on the phone. He spoke with Eric Bowman, Mr. Hood's attorney, and he spoke with Alonzo Hickerson, his mentor. So in this call, Mr. Hood's attorneys, or whoever was on the phone, because we don't really know, knew they had to explain, they had to account for what Mr. Miller was going to say. Because what Mr. Miller was going to say would show that Markeith Morris could not have been part of anything that happened here at the gate. And so Eric Hood's testimony does just that. It matches just ever so perfectly with what Jacob Miller says. And they knew they had to do it quickly in that interview, because if they don't, and Eric Hood commits again to what he had said 9 times before, and when the police ultimately figure out what Jacob Miller is saying, Mr. Hood's credibility is out the window. This case is gone. Any leverage he has is gone. And of course, the key element of this conversation, as is evidenced in what Mr. Hood said in this interview, is that you had to double down on Marcus. If Markeith Morris was going to be out, if he wasn't going to be someone who had taken part in this assault, Marcus Morris better be there. Because if it's just Julius Cain and a couple other people I don't know, well, that's not worth anything. And a final point on this, if Mr. Hood had actually seen the Morrises assault him, as he had said 9 times before, why would he ever have changed his story? What possibly could have caused him to change his story in that account? We know that Eric Hood has made a series of lies, engaged in a series of deceptions in the course of this case. One of them, Mr. Fisher referred to as though it's no big deal, it's the head, it's the face, whatever. It's all in the same vicinity, right? Vicinity. He's interviewed Mr. Hood by the police substantively 4 to 5 times in this case. In not a single one of those interviews did he say Marcus Morris kicked him in the nose. You all have your instructions. You all heard Mr. Fisher refer multiple times to a stipulation where we agreed that Mr. Hood had his nose broken, because it's an important fact. It is an element of one of the crimes charged here. This is a critically important thing, him having broken his nose. So in the January 26th interview, when the detective asks him, where did Marcus kick you at? In my head. Do you remember where? Which side? Over this side. On your left side. On my left side? Above your ear? Mm-hmm. And could you tell where Marcus was kicking you? In my head. And I'll just point out that the only time this ever came out, this statement came out, was on redirect. It wasn't on Mr. Hood's direct testimony, where I would have an opportunity to cross-examine and impeach him with that. It was on redirect that he mentioned this for the first and only time. We know that Mr. Hood was not truthful, that he deceived the detective regarding his relationship with Ms. Sherrod, that he was deceitful about his relationship with Julius Cain, suggesting that there was no relationship whatsoever, when the evidence shows there was a clear dislike between the two of them. And when I asked him about his relationship with, I think it was Mr. Fisher who had asked him on redirect about his relationship with his civil lawyers, Mr. Hood said that he didn't immediately try to hire any lawyer after this incident happened. Well, you'll have the call log and you'll be able to see the 1026 phone call that Mr. Hood had with the civil attorney. And you'll see the text, or you saw the text that was sent just before that, where the lawyer is offering to have a $1 million demand letter in the Morris agent's hands by Monday morning. And on redirect, Mr. Hood then said he's barely spoken with his civil attorneys. Well, again, I commend you to look to the phone records. Those will show you not just the 12-minute phone call in the context of this interview, but between Mr. Hood and Eric Bowman, 78 calls. This is a period from January 24th to February 24th or 25th. 78 calls totaling 425 minutes over that month. And that in this critical time period, so this is between the first recorded interview the detective has and the second one where Mr. Hood changes his account as to Markeith, there are 8 calls between him and his attorneys. Mr. Hood also lied to the detective when he said there was no financial motive animating his interest in this. He said this was all about principle, and it was all about 5 guys who would beat him up. He saw them all equally. There was no distinction he wanted to make. Well, his testimony and the text messages reveal, I think, an obsession or a strong interest in the Morrises, and a singular focus, for sure, on cashing in on that lottery ticket that had eluded him years earlier when the Morrises cut off their relationship with him. We know, and I just referred to that 1024 text from a lawyer about a $1 million demand. On January 26th, he texted Sharika Sharad, if the lawyers release news of this incident to the media, cash is out. On January 28th, he emails somebody else or texts someone else, I have over $1 million case that I'm going to win. So with that being said, I won't have to do this work anymore and can focus on me. The next day, why would I want her? I'm not chasing women, I'm chasing money. 5 days later, to a friend named Solomon, but like the detective told me last night, they're going to pay for this and out of pocket. The next day, to someone named Rudy Thomas, real good too, the detective told me today that he's sorry this happened and I'm going through pain, but I bet people wish they were you right now. And then he wrote, and I think the lawsuit is for $10 million, 5 each for the case. 6 days later, to Rondé, who I think he testified was Rondé Hollis Jefferson, should be here though, talked to the detective last night, and they're going to file charges and arrest them. So after that, they should be looking to settle quite fast. But if they're talking $5 million each, they can kick rocks. And he said, won't take nothing less than 7, starting at 10. February 25th, back to Solomon. Nope. They call, they being the Morrises, once they get arrested, they have no idea the city of Phoenix is building a case against them, and once they do, that's when our bargaining starts. Mr. Fisher referred to the motive instruction. I'll come back and talk about the evidence regarding any motive that the Morrises would have as to wanting to hurt Eric Hood. I will posit here that this information is relevant, again, not to show that certain things did or did not happen on January 24th, but to show that Mr. Hood's every word out of his mouth is animated by his motive. That everything he says is with an eye towards preserving his ability to leverage this criminal case into some kind of financial claim against the Morrises. Here's Alonzo Hickerson. It's obvious the central role he plays in this case. There's a 729 call that we've talked about. It sets everything in motion, clearly based on lies. There's no dispute about that. Jacob Miller says not only did he not talk to Mr. Hickerson that night, but he never told him that he saw the twins physically assaulting Erica because it didn't happen. And then Alonzo Hickerson arranges within an hour or two of that for his associate, Eric Bowman, to represent Erica. There's 10 calls between the two of them back and forth that night. There's 4 calls between the two of them, totaling 40 minutes over the next 2 days. There are 67 calls between the two of them. Again, all this will be evident from the call log, totaling 408 minutes over the next month. Mr. Hood told you from the stand that he spoke to Mr. Hickerson during this time because it was comforting to him. The evidence demonstrates it was far more than that. So we have direct evidence of the subject matter described in 3 phone calls. The one, that initial call that Mr. Hood described, what Mr. Hickerson said, and then 2 later confrontation calls. The parts of those that came out through testimony, you all recall there was no such things as comforting words. I hope you're okay. I'm sorry this happened to you. All the talk was about what witnesses were going to say and the possibility of a financial payout. There was Mr. Hickerson's statement to Mr. Hood that Jacob Miller was not going to play ball. Then he said that Jacob Miller will not lie if he takes the stand. And then, of course, the evidence. I mean, it's remarkable and astounding and disturbing that this happened, let alone that it came out when it did, but came out that Alonzo Hickerson was witness tampering, that he had asked Mr. Miller and Mr. Halal to provide false testimony, to implicate the Morrises. They told Mr. Halal that if he did so, the Morrises would be forced to make some financial settlement to Mr. Hood, and some of that money would flow back to Mr. Halal. Mr. Halal said he had no interest in it. Mr. Hickerson asked if Mr. Halal was sure he knew what Mr. Hickerson was proposing. And of course, we learned all of this in the middle of trial. It's fortunate to have witnesses like Mr. Halal and Mr. Miller who will come in and tell the truth in the way they did, in a way I'm sure was not easy for them. And it's what's unfortunate is that this did not come to light earlier. As the detective told you, this is something for sure he would have investigated. Not only is it a separate crime, but something that calls into question every bit of evidence presented in this case. We have no idea, because it was never investigated, which other witnesses may have been approached by Mr. Hickerson and asked to lie. We have no idea whether Ms. Sherrod was approached by Mr. Hickerson and asked to lie. And we have no idea what Mr. Hood's involvement in this is. All we have is the statement from Mr. Hood from the stand that he didn't know about this and he had no part in it. So let's look at the evidence and judge that claim based on what we do know. We know they're mentor-mentee. We know they've known each other for 20 years. We know there's 10 phone calls between these two guys before the first recorded interview that Eric Hood provides. We know that Mr. Hickerson arranges for him to have a lawyer. We know there's 4 lengthy calls between the two of them before the next recorded interview where he changes the stories to Markeith. We know there are 2 changed stories that Eric Hood has, and then he changed them. The first, it's not necessarily a changed story, but certainly a changed approach, just going to go home as to go in, based specifically and directly on what Mr. Hickerson told him. And then we know there's a second phone call. We don't know who's on it, but we know there's a changed story that comes out of that. And we know these guys talk on the phone for 408 minutes over the next month. It goes without saying that there's no need to ask witnesses to lie if the truth is right and good and supports your claim. And it's inconceivable that Mr. Hood, given his contact and the subject matter of his discussions that we know about, just the ones we know about, with Mr. Hickerson over that time, that he had no idea what was going on. I submit there's far more circumstantial evidence connecting Mr. Hood to potential witness tampering in this case than there is any of these 3 individuals with the assault. And I further say that this witness tampering alone makes it impossible to believe a single word out of the mouth of Eric Hood. I'll talk a moment about the police investigation. I don't want to belabor this, but there are a couple points worth remembering from my examination of Detective Santos. The first is the unique attention this case was given. Resources, manpower. As the detective told you, if there was evidence showing these guys did it, he would have found it. So you got the best. This is the best evidence. There's nothing better out there. And the other thing I think is significant to remember from that is the institutional momentum that started getting generated behind this case. The detective told you about his nearly daily meetings with his supervisors, the carte blanche that he is given in terms of his overtime and expenses and other personnel he needs to bring into this, that this is not like other cases he was investigated, because you've got some high-profile defendants here, and this is something that the city doesn't want to be seen as cutting favors anybody to. And so once you put those kinds of resources into something, there is, and this happens in every organization, there's just a momentum that builds up behind it. And it becomes harder and harder to see when things are falling apart, when things are not as you believe they should be. It's easier to sort of look past those things, engage in the cognitive bias we all do in our lives, and just press on the investigation because that's what you do. And we know that Santos knew in his January 26th interview of Eric Hood two things. One is we know that he was aware that Sharika Sharad was lying. We know that because of her account being totally at odds with what Mr. Hood told him when he presents them each with the same maps that day. And we know that because we know at that point the police have interviewed a number of individuals, none of whom will corroborate any part of her account of the assault taking place in this area here near the gym doors. And we know that Mr. Hood was lying, and Detective Santos knew it that day. He knew because of Mr. Hood's story as to Markeith Morris. Both of these things can't be true. It can't be true that 9 times before the phone call from the lawyer, for sure, no question, 100%, he knew Markeith was part of this. After the call, I can't say he was back there. At that point, after that interview, the investigation should have ended or gone in a dramatically different direction. Detective Santos told you about his confrontation of Marcus and Markeith Morris at their home. He told you that at that time, he and I were talking about potentially setting up an interview, and he explained elsewhere in the context of his testimony that when he investigates a case, he doesn't inform people he wants to talk to about what information he already has. He doesn't want to potentially taint what it is that they may say, so he's very general. I want to talk to you about the case, and then he goes and interviews. So without telling me and knowing that I had represented both men at that point, he shows up unannounced at their house and starts asking them questions about some guy that they had cut off their relationship with 5 years before. And he knows, by the way, the detective does, that Julius Kane also lives at this house, and that Julius Kane is the prime suspect in this assault that he's investigating, that the Morrises are very close and would likely do something to protect Mr. Kane. And when police have surprise visits like this, it goes without saying, but they're not looking for people to make statements to sort of round out what it is they already know. What they're looking for is for people who they have targets on to say something that is going to come back and haunt them later. And what he got out of Marcus and Markeith were statements that didn't accurately reflect their relationship with Eric Hood. Said they didn't know him. Well, of course, they knew Eric Hood, and they didn't answer those questions in the way they should. It wasn't right, and it's false to say they didn't know him, but that doesn't matter one bit with respect to the facts that you all are to decide. The facts only relate to what the state has shown and to who did what at this assault, and they're telling the detective 14, 15 days after the assault, not accurately, that they didn't know Eric Hood, has no bearing on whether the state has given you evidence to show that they played some role in this. So let's talk about the state's theory of the case based on the evidence that's come through their witnesses and in part addressed by Mr. Fisher minutes ago. So as I get it, the state's theory is there is a 5-year grudge. A 5-year grudge over some kind of misinterpreted text message that nothing happens, not a thing, over a 5-year period of time, despite the fact that the Morrises and Eric Hood know a lot of the same people. He's in regular communication with their older brother. But 5 years later, they've been laying in wait. They learn of his whereabouts from their mother, Angel Morris. And remember, the genesis of the relationship falling apart is that they believe he's has some improper relationship with their mother, and they don't want him to have any relationship with her. But she continues to have some communication with him over this 5-year period. Who are the two people, the last two people on earth that she's going to tell that she's having some communication with Eric Hood? These two guys sitting right over here, her sons, who cut off their relationship with that man because of that very thing. And as Mr. Hood told you, he believes that Angel Morris had no idea about any of this, that he had been assaulted. How cannot be reconciled with the motive, which is granted vague to begin with, but if the motive is anger over the relationship with Thomas E. Morris, that she would be the cause of the flow of information to enable them to know where he was is inconceivable. So, okay, the plan, but let's put that aside for the moment. The plan is now, let's go get this guy, and let's make sure we do it in a public place. Let's do it at the Arts Community Center, where there's going to be a prep school tournament. I don't know how many teams are there. There's at least 2 teams playing that last game. You know there's going to be kids and coaches, referees, parents, the guy who runs the facility, a bunch of people we don't know. This is going to work out great. And we're going to make sure there's plenty of witnesses. Oh, and let's make sure that we're seen. I mean, not only are we, 6'9" and 6'10", so we tend to stand out just based on height. We're twins. We play for the Phoenix Suns. We're going to a basketball tournament. What are the odds that somebody there may recognize us? Oh, and let's make sure we go into the gym as a group. Okay, we're going to have 5 guys. We're all going to go in, and we're going to sit together. We're going to sit together up in the top row of these bleachers, and we're going to make sure that when there's a camera panning that's filming the game like it does for all these prep school games, that we are caught on this camera. That it's just absolutely clear the 5 of us are coming in together. We're sitting together. This is it. This is where it's all happening. Oh, and let's also make sure that Eric Hood sees us. The guy who knows us can ID us and can ID Julius. And so then the Morrises get up and leave early. And I think if you go back and watch the video from the game, you'll see that Mr. Melendez had also left the game a little bit early. And then Mr. Kane is waiting for Mr. Hood outside the doors. I know there was some discussion about how quickly this all happened, but I think what Mr. Miller, Mr. Halal told us is that right after the last game ended is when Ms. Sherrod had come in to ask for help. So we know this all happens very quickly. But back to the theory. So let's make sure that we send to the door to confront Eric Hood the one guy he knows for sure and he knows is closely connected to us, Julius Kane. Oh, and let's have some other guy around who doesn't know it all, just for fun, Chris Melendez. And let's make sure that we're not near this. Let's take Ms. Sherrod's version, because this is the state's theory, right? So, happening at the gym door, in Ms. Sherrod's account is that the twins are somewhere over here by the parking lot, by their car, of course. What she doesn't recognize is that the space that she's describing there is in fact one that exists, and if you look where she put their cars this time, where they are is certainly far away from the gymnasium door to that parking lot. Okay, so now we'll have Mr. Kane confront him at the door, and Mr. Melendez will sneak out there and he'll hit him. And then we know for sure what's going to happen next, right? It's obvious only one thing can happen, which is that he's going to run 135 yards, and he's not going to slip, but his momentum's going to take him down. He's going to fall here by the gate. That's what's going to happen. So let's plan everything knowing for sure that's what's going to happen because, of course, what else could happen? It's not like Mr. Hood could not fall, could decide to fight the two guys who were confronting him at the door, could run back in the gym, could run in a different direction, could do any number of things. So Ms. Sherrod, because the state wants you to believe what she says, let's walk through what she says. She says that he runs to this area by Ramada, doesn't exist anymore, picnic tables that look totally different, 5 guys pounce out there and then start beating him up. This, of course, is a space that, based on her own testimony, that of Joe Murray, who described when he's coming back from the parking lot, kids are all around in this area. So there are plenty of witnesses. So let's make sure, again, there's plenty of people who are going to see us doing this. And make sure, because if we're going to take Ms. Sherrod at her word, it's a clearly illuminated area. There's a light there somewhere. And then Ms. Sherrod goes back into the gym. She comes out with 2 to 3 coaches and a referee who, according to her, run up to the fight, tell people to stop. Only, of course, no one has any recollection of this. There's no coach, there's no referee, there's no other human being who recalls any part of this, including Eric Hood, by the way. All right, so even though 5 people, we've got 2 NBA players, an NFL prospect, 2 other guys, according to Ms. Sherrod, have him down on the ground and are physically assaulting him in this space, somehow Eric Hood is able to get back up. He's being held down by one, but I guess somehow he's able to get back up. He must break his way through this group, and he runs 135, 140 yards to the end of the property. It's poorly lit. It's a property, by the way, there's no evidence that any of these guys have ever been to before. And again, he doesn't run back to the gym from this area, or to the door, or even to his car. He runs totally opposite direction, and then he slips and he falls. And it's a place that's so poorly lit that, as the coaches described to you, they couldn't see it or see what was happening there, and so they were pretty much on top of it. Well, let's pick up what Mr. Hood says. Mr. Hood says that the Morrises had run down to the end of the property with 3 other guys when they chased him. Well, you'll recall that Ms. Sherrod says, no, that didn't happen, because after the 5 guys were assaulting him in this area, 4 of the 5 ran after Mr. Hood when he got up and ran down, but the 5th one of the Morris brothers, she said, stayed back and never went down there. Okay, not sure what to make of that. And then she says that one never left the parking lot. That's the one she got into an argument with. So by the way, as to how she knows the Morrises were there, it's this argument. And she described it for you, that some argument about being from Philly and she's from D.C. or something silly like that. But for sure, she described having an argument with one of the Morrises that in her mind was connected with this, because she saw that Morris, she said, drive off with the person who is Christopher Melendez, who she had seen hit Mr. Hood at the beginning. And it's only after that, only after they got in the car and leave, is the first time that she ever mentions the Morrises. When she had put those 2 things together, the evidence shows. Okay, and so now Miller and Halal come out. So I guess we're now picking up their testimony. Only apparently they've forgotten what Ms. Sherrod saw, because, they don't remember having been out, tried to break up a fight. Now they're back in the gym. She gets them, they come out, and they don't see anything, and they see, Miller says, Markeith Morris in the parking lot. Mr. Halal says he sees both of them standing in the field, and then I guess to accept that, Mr. Hood's version of that, to sort of reconcile what the coaches say with what he says, that all 5 guys ran down and ran back, you would have to believe that the Morrises, along with the other 3, ran down to the end of the property, that Markeith Morris stood and watched. Marcus got in a few looks, and then they ran 100, 120 yards back in the direction of the gymnasium. Markeith did that, I guess, without getting a lick in despite the 5-year grudge that he was holding. And then Marcus, of course, would have run down there, stood for some time, waited for Julius to call him, hit or kicked, and then run back in the direction of the gym. All right, so now, having participated in the altercation, Marcus and Markeith run back, but instead of getting in the getaway car, as Mr. Fisher refers to it, they don't leave. They stand here, whether it's Miller or Halal, somewhere between the parking lot and this field, and they wait. And they wait for some other people to come out. And then when the coaches come out, they run back down in the direction of where this altercation is taking place. Because just in case, people wouldn't have recognized them from walking in the gym, from having 5 people together, from being a 6'9", 6'10" twin professional basketball player, you want to make sure that you place yourself right next to the altercation that is taking place, so that these two individuals who you do not know, who are adults, will be able to connect you with this event. You want to make sure that those guys can do that, because they will clearly know who you are, and you want to make sure that nobody has any doubt about this. And then the icing on the cake is you want to make sure you walk back with Christopher Melendez, the person who these coaches, they just saw him finishing off in the assault with Eric Hood. And then on the way back, get in an argument with the woman who was with Eric Hood that night, and then get in your car with Christopher Melendez and leave. It's beyond inconceivable and incredible, that timeline, but that's effectively what the state's asking you to adopt, suggesting that there is either principal or liability as accomplices. I mean, I'll say for the moment, there's no evidence of any kind of accomplice liability. There's no evidence of planning, no evidence of solicitation, aiding, counseling, nothing. I mean, what there is, and I'll talk about in a second, is mere presence, nothing more. Your job as jurors, Mr. Bellinger touched on some of this in his initial comments with you in jury selection. It's indispensable, really, it is, to our system of justice. It requires that you follow closely the court's instructions, that you weigh the evidence and you assess whether the state has met its burden to prove the elements of these offenses beyond a reasonable doubt. It sounds easy, but it's very difficult. The instructions, you probably got some sense of it, but when you're back in the jury room, it'll make even more sense to you that they can be awkward. They'll cause you to put aside, preconceptions, or force you to put aside preconceptions that you have, and think about solving a problem and coming to a solution in a different way, where you can only focus on the evidence that's presented here, and always through the lens of the state having to meet its burden. And many aspects of this are fundamental to our system of justice. One of the instructions in there is the presumption of innocence, and we're all presumed innocent. And it remains that way until the state produces compelling evidence that leaves you without a single doubt based upon reason. If you have any doubt, and that doubt is based upon reason about the state's theory of the case, no matter what else you feel, no matter what else is in your gut, gosh, I know the state hasn't proven its case, but I just feel like these guys, they're friends with Julius Cain and Chris Melendez, and there's some notion I have that they don't like Eric Hood. I feel bad about, reaching a particular outcome. That's not an option. When the state hasn't met its burden of proof, your job is done, and you only have one choice to make. Another key principle in our system is we do not force people to testify as criminal defendants. This is something that's embedded in our Constitution. But it goes against what most of us think as human beings. We all think that, gosh, if somebody has, nothing to hide, then they should really get up and talk. I would do something in particular. Well, it's simply not true, and not true in our system. The choice, as described in that instruction, is a difficult and complicated one, and one that you cannot in any way hold against Marcus or Markeith Morris. Because if you do, it undermines the entire system that we all depend on, every last one of us. And it suggests, by the way, a false premise, and that is that a defendant somehow needs to prove their innocence. The only thing you're doing is reviewing the evidence presented by the state, cross-examined by us. That's it. The mere presence instruction, which Mr. Fisher alluded to, but I think it's worth going back to and discussing for a moment. Guilt cannot be established by a defendant's mere presence at a crime scene, mere association with another person at a crime scene, or mere knowledge that a crime is being committed. The fact that a defendant may have been present or knew that a crime was being committed does not in and of itself make a defendant guilty of the crime charged. One who is merely present is a passive observer who lacked criminal intent and did not participate in the crime. That instruction could not apply more to the facts that have come into evidence in this case. Clearly, Marcus Morris and Markeith Morris had an association with the two individuals who have admitted that they assaulted Eric Hood. And they had some prior association with Eric Hood. Based on the testimony provided by Jacob Miller and Mustafa Halal, they are clearly within the vicinity of something that's happening, and one could reasonably infer from that, at least at some point, some knowledge as to what is happening there when they are down in that physical space. But that's all there is. There's not proof of any more. And indeed, what they did is described perfectly in that last sentence. One who is merely present, and that's all the evidence shows, mere presence, is a passive observer who lacked criminal intent and did not participate in the crime. You need to apply the standard that we had talked about a couple weeks ago. That is beyond a reasonable doubt. It's the most stringent standard we have in our legal system. The state starts at zero with respect to its proof. And it's got to prove evidence beyond a reasonable doubt of the crimes charged. It's got to overcome every doubt based on reason, and it can't do so here, not even close. Reasonable doubt. Mustafa Halal's testimony alone is reasonable doubt. Jacob Miller's testimony as to Markeith is reasonable doubt. Mr. Ruiz and Mr. Rivera saying that nobody approximating the heights or close to the heights of the twins was seen coming down that driveway is reasonable doubt. Mr. Hood's telling the detective and telling you he was going to go home before he gets this phone call from Alonzo Hickerson, that's reasonable doubt. His 180-degree turn as to Markeith Morris is reasonable doubt. His subsequent doubling down on Marcus Morris is reasonable doubt. Those things show, in combination, a clear willingness to lie, a willingness to do so in coordination with his lawyer, who's ever on the phone with him, to do so about the Morrises specifically, to conform the evidence that he's giving in this case, to maintain his credibility, to keep this case alive, to keep the pressure on these guys through this case to get some kind of financial reward. But his financial motive is reasonable doubt. His motive for payback against the Morrises, kids that he had spent a lot of time trying to develop as potential clients who ended up not going with him, that's reasonable doubt. And his relationship with Alonzo Hickerson, his mentor. I know he tried to distance himself at some point in his testimony. Mr. Hickerson's one of his mentors, but he was clear with the detective. He is my mentor, singular. And we know Alonzo Hickerson, based on the testimony of two witnesses, he was actively trying to get them to lie specifically to implicate Marcus Morris and Markeith Morris. And he told one of those witnesses, if he did so, the Morrises would be forced to pay a sum of money to Mr. Hood, and some of that would come back to them. Reasonable doubt. Ms. Sherrod's unsupported, directly contradicted statements, reasonable doubt. Her explicit motive to lie in this case to help Eric Hood, reasonable doubt. And her explicit financial motive is reasonable doubt. I asked at the beginning of this case a hypothetical question. Why are we here if we know what happened, if we know what Mr. Melendez and Mr. Kane did, and they've taken responsibility for it? Well, we're here because people in our system haven't done their job. The system relies on everyone doing their job. We want and rely on victims to tell the truth, witnesses to do that, police to conduct a full and thorough, complete investigation. And when they come across evidence that is concerning, they follow up on it and they make sure that if they're going to charge somebody, they charge the right person. And if there's the possibility of witness tampering, they investigate that, because there's few things more serious in our system than that. And we rely on our county attorney's office to present evidence that is credible and fair and accurately describes what happened. Well, unfortunately, we haven't had the benefit of those other checks in the system working out. So what's come to you, you're the last stop. You are the last stop in our system. This is why we have jury trials. When everyone else fails to do their job, whether it's intentionally or negligent or institutional momentum, it falls on you. It falls on you to make that hard decision. Hard decision, maybe emotionally, but easy decision based on the evidence that is produced here. That is evidence not coming close to meeting the state's burden. And we ask that you acquit Marcus Morris, or Keith Morris, and Gerald Bowman.
Thank you.